We all know that running global-scale multi-cloud applications is difficult and expensive, but being locked into a single cloud provider sucks. That's why our friends at Section created the platform for easy and cost-effective multi-cloud operations. Section actually makes it easier to operate multi-cloud than on your current single cloud. Applications run in the best locations for end-user performance, reliability, and security, and you get to focus on building your apps, not your infrastructure. Visit section.io/cloudcast to sign up for free with no credit card required. You can be running in under a minute. That's section.io/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. Another Sunday Perspective, first Sunday Perspective of 2023. 2023 is here. Hope everybody's doing well. We're now past the official date when you, according to Larry David, can say Happy New Year, but hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's having a Happy New Year so far. Hope everybody's healthy and have gotten through the holidays and doing well. So what I want to try and do in today's Sunday Perspective, kind of going back a little bit to the roots of the original Sunday Perspectives and really kind of looking at a little bit of historical context of something that still is a big piece of what's going on in the world today. In fact, is still kind of setting a tone for what's going on today. Really want to look at the evolution of Microsoft and how they've evolved really since Satya Nadella took over. I don't want to go all the way back to the Bill Gates or even the Steve Ballmer or the Paul Allen days, but I want to take a look at sort of from Satya Nadella, because I think if we look at maybe the 5 or 6 best leaders over the last decade or so, he's got to be right up there, maybe 1 or 2, maybe along with kind of the leadership team at Apple, whether it was Steve Jobs getting them through that transition or Tim Cook with the amazing work that he's done to grow Apple since then. But I want to kind of look at that because I especially in the context of our world, where it's a lot of enterprise technology. It is cloud computing. It's kind of the transition from previous generations to this generation. Not only is the transition with Microsoft really interesting, but where Satya took over is really interesting. So, just want to put a couple of things in context. 2001, just to put some numbers in context. 2001, internet bubble bursting time frame. Microsoft's at $31 billion. 2007, so right before the housing market financial crash happened, $62 billion. So between those two crashes, they doubled in size. When Satya went to take over, the company had grown from 2007 to 2014 only to $88 billion. And this included the transition that was, Bill Gates stepping down from being the CEO, Steve Ballmer taking over, Steve Ballmer, deciding to switch them from being a kind of just a software company to being a services company. It bought Nokia and, wanted them to be in the hardware business and a bunch of other things. So Satya takes over, 2014, again, $88 billion of revenue. By 2019, just before the pandemic, just before the huge sort of burst that we saw from a lot of the tech companies, he had grown the company to $153 billion. So almost doubled the size of the company, a little less, maybe 90%, 85, 90%, in terms of that in 5 years, and did a number of things that we're going to kind of dig into. And then by 2022, and again, there's some sort of expansion in there with the pandemic and everything, but got the company to almost $200 billion. So it took over the company. It was $88 billion. Just 8 years later, it's $200 billion. So, double the growth, 2.5 times the growth. Pretty interesting thing. 90 acquisitions since he took over. Things that happened on his watch. Office 365. I'm sorry, that's not right. Office 365 becoming a huge thing, gaming. But the reason the reason that triggered me for this Sunday Perspective show, and we'll dig into it after the break, is Microsoft just recently announced that they have reached the point where their non-software business, so the non-sort of like installed software on devices business, is now only half of the business, right? And so just to put it in perspective, it was like I think it was 88 billion at the time when Satya took over, $4 billion in what they considered cloud revenue or sort of connected revenue. So at the time, $84 billion was essentially software. $4 billion was was sort of cloud and connected types of things. And now it's at 50-50. And obviously some things have changed in there. But I really kind of want to walk through what that means. And the reason I think this is interesting, not just as a historical retrospective, but really looking at, we spent a lot of time looking at new technologies and startups and all that sort of stuff. But it's also really important to sort of look at the big companies in our industry, sort of the 800-pound gorillas, if you will, and how they transition, because it's not very usual to see a company make it from one era of computing to the next. And so we'll dig into that after the break. Today's show is sponsored by CloudZero. For software-driven companies focused on growing margins, CloudZero is the only cloud cost intelligence platform that puts engineering in control by connecting technical decisions to business results. By analyzing cloud services like AWS and Snowflake, CloudZero provides real-time cost insights that help you maximize margins. Engineering teams can answer critical questions like, who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? What's the cost impact of re-architecting this application? With cost anomaly alerts via Slack, product-specific data views, and granular engineering context that makes it easy to investigate any cost, CloudZero is your complete cloud cost intelligence platform, connecting the dots between high-level trends and individual line items. Join companies like Drift, Rapid7, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. That's cloudzero.com/cloudcast. And we're back. Good to be with everybody. As we mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive into how Microsoft's really evolved, and specifically how they've evolved since Satya Nadella took over in 2014 from Steve Ballmer. So, huge moment for Microsoft at the time. This is the first time they had kind of one of the non-original people. Steve Ballmer wasn't necessarily considered one of the founders of Microsoft, but really was the first salesperson for Microsoft, was there since the very beginning. And so Bill's gone, Steve's gone, Paul Allen is out of the picture, has been out of the picture for a long time. And this guy, Satya Nadella, who, people who knew Microsoft knew who he was, but, it wasn't like a former CEO was moving over. It wasn't like somebody from Oracle was coming to take over. It wasn't like, it was a new era at Microsoft. And Satya was taking over at the time when, Windows was still king, Office was still king, installed software was still king. As I mentioned, it was an $88 billion company. It was a huge company. Essentially, it was, I think, let's put it in perspective, it was basically the same size as AWS at that time. I think AWS is around the $80 to $90 billion run rate. So about the same. And essentially, he was coming in and he was kind of having to fix Steve Ballmer's strategy, which, he had acquired Nokia at the time. He was, he's trying to get in the phone business. Microsoft had launched the iPhone in 2007. Microsoft really missed the boat on a number of things. And so the first context I want to talk about, for those of you that are maybe newer to the industry, less than 15 years, it's really unusual to see companies transition and be leaders from one computing era to the next. And if we think about the computing eras that have been out there, there's Mainframe, which was primarily IBM's business. They created the marketplace. They dominated the marketplace. Yes, there was a few other mainframe companies, but they essentially dominated that space. Then you had sort of the mini market. So this is where you had DEC and a number of other companies that sort of came along, but never really were able to transition to the next phase. So IBM transitioned from mainframe kind of through mini. They did AS400. They transitioned into the PC era, but they kind of began to fail there. That's where IBM started to, have to rethink itself. Microsoft takes off in the PC era. Obviously, they, have the historic deal with IBM where IBM decides not to, buy them, but rather to install their Windows operating system on their PCs and basically create the PC market along with Intel. So Microsoft dominates in that space, obviously becomes enormously large, enormously wealthy. Bill Gates becomes the wealthiest man in the world. And then we sort of transitioned, and if we go back to about 1995, this is when the internet starts taking off. Obviously the internet, in a real historical context, was started back in the 60s and 70s, but really kind of commercially took off kind of the mid 90s, and Microsoft was a little behind there, right? They didn't necessarily have a browser; they weren't the original browser company. So, the next era was really the internet era, and they did very, very well in the internet era. Now, this is where they kind of got themselves in trouble with some antitrust sort of stuff, but they survived through the internet era. And then, the internet sort of scale stuff starts to take off. People like Google become a big deal. SaaS type of offerings become a thing. And then the mobile era kicks in. And Microsoft essentially missed the mobile era. And for those of you that listen to folks like Ben Thompson, Ben's done an excellent job of really talking about why Microsoft missed the mobile era, why they lost out to Apple. Apple was, basically built a purpose-built thing. Microsoft was basically trying to replicate the PC experience into a phone. They didn't necessarily know how to miniaturize what they were doing. They didn't realize it was going to be a completely different ecosystem of people. So not only they missed that, but then they missed the shift to this other kind of computing, right? So people doing, leveraging a Mac, leveraging computing like a Chromebook that was just browser-based. So they kind of missed that era. They missed sort of owning hardware. So there was a lot of, there's got a lot of turmoil at Microsoft around the time when Satya took over. In fact, during his first year, their revenue was down. So, there was a lot of concern. I think in the first couple of years, revenue was down. And there's a lot of concern like, Microsoft is at the end. This guy's not going to be able to do it. He's not one of the founders. He doesn't know the company well enough. And, if we look back at his era, like I said, starting 2014, going through 2022, they go from $88 billion to, basically $200 billion here in 2022, 90 acquisitions. So he was very good at basically figuring out, how do we expand the business into new things. I wrote down a few things in terms of, what sort of lessons we can take from what they did and what he really drove. So I think the first thing was, obviously he comes in, and you can argue different things about, where Microsoft was at the time. I mean, they still had some gigantic cash cow businesses. I mean, they were an $88 billion business. They were still doing extremely well in software. And that cash cow business did allow them to, to make some of these transitions. But I think the first thing that they figured out was they had to be patient, right? I mean, many of the Microsoft investments at the time, so just put it in perspective, Xbox was started in 2001, very different from Microsoft. They got in the hardware business. They're in gaming, which was different than the types of things people were doing on Windows. Office 365 really kicked off in 2001. So, they went from Office 360, Office installed way back in 2001, all the way to when he was there. They still hadn't built up, a huge business in 10 plus years, 11, 12, 13 plus years. Right. Azure started in 2008. Azure was, struggled like crazy. They basically, started off being just a PaaS, kind of started over. They were going to be Windows centric. They could have given up. They could have, been, they could have been the IBM Cloud of what was going on. It could have been like a lot of it. They could have been like the VMware Cloud that just folded up, right? And then, he really started to put his stamp of, kind of his view of the world on things. And I think the next thing they really did was, like I said, they bought a lot of new capabilities, but yet they didn't necessarily launch tons and tons of new brands. They were looking for, how do we augment, the computing experience? How do we augment the gaming experience? How do we augment the collaboration experience? How do we do a lot of those things? So, it was very smart to realize that, it's while Microsoft, used to have huge R&D budgets and huge, Microsoft Research was a thing. They literally had an entire organization just for research. I think he probably realized that type of organization that wasn't necessarily directly involved with the products, was really more for R&D, wasn't necessarily going to be, it's beneficial, right? It was going to be slow. It was going to be difficult to integrate. You had a lot of cultural things that he had to sort of break down. So made a lot of acquisitions. Those were things that could be features that could be added to these platforms that they have. They could accelerate in areas in which they were behind. So I think acquisitions have been a big piece of what they've done. I think the biggest thing that he did, especially early on, was he broke the limitations that were holding them back from expanding markets. And really what this was the move to cross-platform support. So if you think back, and people forget this, Microsoft used to be a company that was incredibly vertical in their technology stack, right? So whether you were using, it was PC hardware, Windows operating system on Intel hardware, Windows operating system, Office, the Office suite, not Office 365, the Office suite installed on the software. And then if you were running Windows Server, for example, SQL Server had to run on Windows and other things. And now, we start to see it start to break, right? Where Office could run on macOS, it could run on an iPad. We begin to see things like SQL running on Linux and other things like that. We see Linux becoming a bigger and bigger piece of Azure. And so I think he very much sort of stepped back and almost went back to the original days of Microsoft and said, hey, why was Microsoft so incredibly successful? And it was, they want to be the computing thing everywhere computing is. And it just so happened that when they were doing it back in the early PC days, it was just PCs. But, now we're on tablets and mobile devices and kiosks and in the cloud and on laptops and on desktops and on a lot of things. And so they broke that. And that was I put some links in the show notes. That was an incredibly difficult thing to do because, the company, its ecosystem, all of the, hundreds and hundreds of millions of lines of code and hundreds of billions of hours of work were tied to Windows. And so they had to figure out, how do we do that? How do we become experts in things that aren't necessarily Linux, macOS, Android, Linux, variations of Linux, all those types of things. So I think that was incredibly important. You saw them admit failure in certain cases, things like Bing, which for those who don't remember, Microsoft has a thing called Bing, which is a search engine. They were going to try and compete with Google. They eventually, gave in and allowed Google to run the back end of Bing, had a revenue sharing type of thing. So I think they became humble. They realized they weren't going to be the dominant company like they had been in everything they did previously, but they were still a brand that people really trusted, that people really believed in, that people wanted to invest in. But they had to get over this. Hey, we made a decent number of mistakes, and people were wondering if we were going to even survive in the next. There were literally people who were like, I don't know if Microsoft's going to keep. It was a lot of like, oh, maybe they're going to be the next IBM, they're going to be the next DEC, they're going to be the next, whoever that doesn't make it to the next generation. So I think that's really important. I think, as I think about maybe what some of the parallels are to that, Red Hat has some things where they sort of tie everything to Red Hat Enterprise Linux. That has, some pros and cons to it. IBM has had some of that with, how much they tie things to IBM Cloud or Mainframe. They've changed a little bit of that, but not completely. The other one that comes to mind is Cisco, especially in the networking space. It was always, you had to buy hardware and software. So like hardware plus the Catalyst operating system or iOS for routing. Whereas you saw a lot of other things begin to break those things apart, be able to use commodity hardware or, OEM'd hardware with their own software, be able to run their software on different types of things. So I think Microsoft, made an incredibly difficult decision there, but what turned out to be an incredibly powerful thing in realizing that they had expertise, not just in the thing that locked them in, but they could build expertise in all of the ways that people did computing. Huge risk there that Satya take, but seems to have paid off very, very well. I think the next thing is really the willingness to embrace new business models. A lot of times you get very stuck in how you do business models, who your partners are, who your channel partners are, how they make money, what you've known and done for a long time, what your sales force knows. And, I think back to when they started, forcing customers to, move to Office 365, there was a lot of tie-ins to, hey, if you're moving to Office 365, we're also going to throw in credits for Azure. And, early on, those credits just went and did nothing, right? They were, people were given credits, but they had no motivation to do it. The customers weren't motivated to do it. Microsoft eventually had to change the way they did business. They changed the way that salespeople couldn't just include credits, but they were going to get paid only when people use those credits. So they had to encourage customers to use those credits in the Azure cloud. They had to force the product managers to build products that people wanted to use in the Azure cloud. They weren't just going to be able to sort of rely on the ELA forever. The thing that had sort of made their salespeople very rich, made their customers, just made things really easy for the customer. They didn't have to think about it. But they wanted to actively encourage customers to move to the new paradigm, partially because, they wanted to be able to prove that there was value there for the customers, but also because Microsoft had to prove that, they could keep up with an Amazon or Google or Apple or the other, behemoths that were really imprinting on their space and were building, at the time, better products than them. So they had to embrace the cloud. They had to embrace pay-as-you-go models, not just year-long, 3-year-long, 5-year-long ELAs. You saw them beginning to get into services that were things like GitHub, things like LinkedIn, stuff that was different than what they did. They had to learn how to be in the advertising business. They had to learn how to run cloud services. Right? They've struggled for a long time to be able to run cloud services really well. I think they're getting better at it. We're seeing less outages in the Microsoft cloud. There's still some things that are probably not as good as Amazon is and some other places, but they've built businesses around not only allowing them to compete, forcing themselves to build value, but also to learn how to do those things well. And then finally, they've really, they've invested for the future. And we see companies that get big start to worry about, I don't want to lose what I have. I'm going to double down on that. I'm going to raise the prices on that. Sometimes they start buying some sort of augmented businesses. And this is difficult. It's difficult to make the choice to decide to invest in the future when the future may feel like it commoditizes what you do. It may feel like it cannibalizes what you do today. And, again, it's that, is the experience of Office 365 in the cloud as good as, the local experience I have with, just Office running on my laptop? Well, for a long time it wasn't, but they had to force themselves to get there because they knew over time, as they were watching new computing paradigms happen, what do I do when somebody has a phone and a laptop? They're not going to want to install the software twice. They're not going to want to be working on a document and then not be able to move to a different device and continue working on a document or whatever the experience was. So, we've seen them do that. We've seen them make some really interesting acquisitions. I think GitHub has really reinforced their kind of foothold as being maybe the company that's the best to work with for developers, as opposed to anything else. Nobody else has really stepped in to be the go-to company for working with developers. We've seen people try. We've seen what VMware did with Spring. We've seen we've seen Google try and do some things with developers that haven't necessarily panned out. Apple obviously has done quite a bit with what people do for iOS, but in terms of like business applications, Microsoft still probably has the largest number of developers, and things like GitHub are were huge bets. $8 billion acquisition, $7.5 billion acquisition, but it sort of reinforces for the future that they should be the center of where people go to, right? They used to be Windows. It used to be the Windows ecosystem and the Windows SDKs and APIs. It's now GitHub and the other things that are going on there. We're seeing them making huge investments around things like OpenAI. We're seeing them do things, in GitHub with Copilot in shaping the future of development. So, I think there's some things to be said, like, hey, Microsoft has some, huge natural advantages because they had, cash cow businesses in the past. They had, huge amounts of funding. But I think they went through the same sort of things that other companies did. They went through the crash of 2001. They went through the crash of 2008. They went through a leadership change in which the founder was not the company. And, you can point to a lot of other companies who haven't necessarily gone through this, or they've gone through it and they've failed and they've given up on things. And Microsoft's obviously not the only one. We've seen Google Cloud begin to make a very good transition from, the earliest days of Diane Green to George Kurian. We'll see how AWS transitions from Andy Jassy to Adam Selipsky. I think that's another area that we may be looking at a Sunday perspective in a few years and saying, hey, was that a good choice? Have they been able to transition out of what was the early advantages they had and the revenues that they had? Have they been able to grow like that? But, I kind of wanted to use this as an interesting Sunday perspectives because, I think about, especially if I just think about Microsoft versus say like AWS, because AWS is the center of a lot of conversations. Both companies about $80 billion at the time when we saw a big transition from, one leader to another, somebody who'd been there, essentially been sort of the founder of it for a long time. They've got some cash cow businesses, but we will see. We will see if the new leadership in that space can mimic what Microsoft has done. And so I think that'll be an interesting sort of comparison to make is the transition from Steve Ballmer to Satya Nadella. Will it look anything like the transition from Andy Jassy to Adam Selipsky? Same sort of numbers. Both companies are investing huge amounts of capex. Amazon's still much larger capex investment, and there's a lot of things in the show notes that are worth digging into if you really want to. But just kind of wanted to look at that. It got me thinking, especially as we start this new year, and we had thought about how reInvent went and kind of the feedback from people on reInvent and the transition they're beginning to go through. These transitions aren't easy. But for companies to be able to get from one computing era into the next one, and we don't really know yet what the next one's going to be, whether it's, we've seen the dabbling of Web3, that's still kind of in its infant stages. We're not exactly sure what that is. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of interesting things happen with AI, but is AI really a next thing, or is that just, capability of the cloud era? So going to be really interesting to see, I think. I always like to look at these things, as I've mentioned a lot of times, historically and put them in context with other things so that there's things you can compare them against. So, again, we have always been incredibly impressed with Satya. I think sometimes when we step back and look at the bigger picture of what he's done to guide the team at Microsoft, needs to be in that pantheon of top 5, top 7 or 8 leaders, especially, maybe in computing, for the work that he's been able to do in really transforming what was previously one of the biggest companies that people were beginning to wonder if they had fallen on hard times, they weren't going to make it. And they're now, right at the forefront of whatever the next generation of things are going to look like. So with that, I'll wrap it up. Another Sunday perspective. Hopefully this was interesting to you. We've got a few that we may do kind of in the format of kind of historical context and what it looks like today here in the first few weeks of 2023. But hope you're enjoying the Sunday perspectives. Hope you're enjoying the look ahead shows on Wednesday. We've started doing those. There are a bunch of really, really good ones that we've already recorded that'll be coming out over the next couple of weeks. Hope you all enjoy them. And last thing, as Aaron always mentions, and I always seem to forget, if you get a chance, we'd love you to rate the show wherever you listen to the show, whether that's on iTunes or in your browser or your podcast player, however you listen to the show. We'd love feedback. We got a couple of really great 5-star reviews this past week, so thank you to everybody who maybe new to it. And, we got some really good feedback of people who are, new to the industry, starting to listen to it. They like the new 2023 look ahead shows. So if you get a chance, give us some feedback. We always like to hear feedback. Always encourage it if you get a chance to. The other thing is it helps us. The better the rating. Not just asking for 5 stars, but if you really like the show, 5-star ratings really help us to grow the show because it boosts us up in visibility. And when people are searching for stuff, they're searching for cloud computing or searching for whatever topic interests them. So anyways, with that, thank you all for listening. Thank you very much. Hope you're having a good week. Hope if you're listening to this on a Monday, it gets you started for a good week. Anyways, I will talk to you later.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.